Okay, good afternoon, James. Can you see me and hear me okay?
Yes, I can, yeah.
Yeah, great. Well, I'm Dr. Geoff Maguire. I'm a fellow in Spanish here at Gonfalon Keys College. And today I'm joined by...
I'm Dr. Ashwiny Kistnareddy. I'm the lecturess at Gonfalon Keys, and I'm also DOS at Lucy Cavendish College.
Okay, great. Well, thanks very much for coming to see us today, James. Just to let you know what's going to happen over the next 25 minutes or so, we'll spend probably about 10 or 15 minutes talking about your personal statement, some of the things that you've read, some of the things that you've seen, and really the kind of the reasons why you want to study modern languages here at Cambridge. And then we'll move on for the final 5 or 10 minutes to talk about the passage that you've had the chance to look at over the last 20 minutes or so. Just to let you know, if there are any technical hitches on the way through, feel free to leave and then join again, and we'll be waiting here for you. We know that this is a difficult platform to use, so we're well prepared and well experienced in technical hitches. There will also be some time for you at the end to ask any questions, so feel free to do that if you want to. I should also say, if Ashwiny or I use any words that you've never come across before, or any terms or terminology, do feel free to ask us to explain those or to use other words. We'd be more than happy to do that. Okay?
Yeah, that's all fine.
Great. Ashwiny, would you like to kick off?
Yes, so James, I'm going to start with the most basic and important probably question of this interview, which is why do you want to study modern languages at Cambridge?
Well, sort of since I started secondary school in year 7, when I sort of started learning Spanish properly, I developed an interest in languages. I made it sort of my long-term ambition to sort of master a language. And then sort of outside the classroom, I started going on holiday to Spain and developed a real sort of interest in its culture, its history, just sort of the wider language. And that sort of developed a real sort of long-term passion. And even sort of in another sense, sort of in an increasingly sort of globalized world, communication is very important, and not everyone speaks English. So sort of Spanish is a growing language. And yeah, so that's sort of my main reason for studying Spanish. And I thought if I'm going to make this sort of a long-term ambition, that there's sort of no real better place than Cambridge to study that.
Thank you.
I was really interested to read in your personal statement that you've already studied some texts and watched some films. One that caught my attention was Laura Esquivel's Como agua para chocolate.
Yes.
I think you read at A-level, is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. What did you think of that text? Did you like it? Did you find it interesting? I
did, yeah. I mean, it's not something that I've particularly come across before in terms of the style of text. It was something slightly different. This whole idea of magical realism isn't really something that I'd come across before. So yeah, in that sense, in that it was something quite original, sort of, and then also just reading a book from another language as well and from another culture. Yeah, it was quite a rewarding experience.
So you said that you'd never come across magical realism before. How would you describe magical realism to someone who's never come across it before?
In simple terms, I'd say that it's sort of a blending of reality and fantasy, in that the real is sort of distorted, and it's not entire fantasy, in that it doesn't sort of completely break all natural laws, and it's not completely inconceivable, but sort of reality does things that maybe it wouldn't. And sort of in a literary sense, I guess it's sort of quite often used for symbolic effects. And I think that's sort of applied in Como agua.
Could you give us some specific examples from that text of fantasy not being broken, but not quite?
I think sort of, well, it's a very sort of culinary text in a way that there's food is very important, and a lot of things sort of go on in the kitchen that maybe are exaggerated, especially with lots of ingredients when Tita's cooking, it's her passion, and that's really conveyed through that. And then also with sort of her love interest with Pedro, like fire is a theme, and fire is present in its natural form, but especially when you get sort of more heightened moments of intimacy, buildings start catching fire. I think the same thing happens with her sister Hertrudis, and sort of it's not just things catch fire, things explode sort of almost instantly, which wouldn't be expected to happen. So mixing it's reality, but not quite, it's not quite fantasy either. It's that sort of liminal in between.
Yeah, I mean, you started off by talking about someone being quite emotionally invested in cooking. That doesn't seem too fantastical to me. That doesn't seem too out of the ordinary. I mean, what is it about cooking and the culinary in the novel that is magically real rather than just simply someone's hobby?
So I think one of the main examples is the wedding between Pedro and Tita's sister. Tita's the protagonist. And then, yeah, the wedding between her love interest, Pedro, and her sister, which she's very sort of resentful about. And Tita, as a talented cook of the family, has to make the wedding cake. And emotion gets to her while she's making it. She sort of cries into the mixture. And then when they're eating this cake at the actual wedding, everyone else bursts out crying as well. And that's this sort of sense of, it's not that is sort of more on the fantasy side, but it's linked to reality.
Yeah.
Can I just ask the question, like really, really quickly? Why do you think that part was actually magical realism rather than just exaggeration, for instance, simple exaggeration?
That's a good question. I think it's mainly because it is a very emotional novel, and the story does generally center around Tita and her emotion. So I think sort of Esquivel was trying to really sort of emphasize and underscore that through using magical realism. It is one of the more important elements of the novel. So instead of simply exaggerating it, which he does in certain areas, she really sort of makes that magically real, just to emphasize the importance of that scene and the sort of a peak in Tita's emotions.
And you mentioned the wedding scene, which I think is an interesting one, because of course she cries into the batter that she's making, the cake batter, and then people at the wedding get sick. I mean, how are we meant to read that? Are we meant to read this as is Tita some sort of evil genius who wants to poison everyone at the wedding, or does she even have any control over what's happening?
Well, I mean, I guess I'd be careful around the term evil genius, but I wouldn't completely dismiss it, because I think to an extent it's true, in that she does sometimes let the emotion get too much for her, and she does have sort of a sense of malice, in that she clearly doesn't want what's best for her sister, in that, that there is a sense of jealousy there. She loathes the structures that she's been born into and has no real agency to change. And I guess you could argue that she does have no agency in this sense, because she doesn't directly will for everyone to cry with the wedding cake. It's not something that she plans. And I think it is described sort of her shock at this happening. It's not something that she necessarily expected to happen. So in this sense, yeah, she probably does have very little agency, but it doesn't mean that she doesn't have any agency throughout the rest of the novel.
Yeah, and there's a sense as well, I suppose, that cooking for her and providing food for others is a means of communication, right? It's a means for her to communicate with the other characters, not by conventional methods, but actually by magically real methods. Can you think of any examples in which she does communicate something to other people through food?
I mean, every chapter is set up with a recipe that sort of then comes into effect in the later chapters. I'm sort of struggling to think of an example, but there's a lot. So in virtually every chapter, there's something new that Tita's cooking. I think her mother makes her cook a lot of things, sort of traditional Mexican dishes.
Yeah.
And a lot of that sort of has an effect on the people that eat it. And I guess it sort of is reflective of Tita's emotional state at the time, because I think not everything they eat causes these sort of drastic, sort of negative reactions. People aren't crying or being unwell every time they eat her food. So I think it does sort of, it's a vessel, it's a way that her emotional state is conveyed, because she doesn't have the agency to say how she truly feels in every situation. So it's sort of her way of communicating her and channeling her inner sense of how she's feeling at that time.
Yeah, I like that idea that you just said about a kind of vessel for communicating her emotion. But if we think about it, I mean, this is a woman who is overly emotional, we might say. We also see this woman being confined to the domestic sphere, very often the kitchen, who communicates through food. I mean, is this just playing with stereotypes? Is this actually damaging in terms of the representation of women, for example? You know, is it a kind of misogynistic text?
Well, I don't think it's necessarily misogynistic. I think, well, I'm assuming Esquivel was Mexican.
Yes.
So it would be, I guess in that sense, it'd be quite strange for her to play on her own sort of stereotypes. So, I mean, I guess you could have, there's a bit of a debate over whether it be a feminist or a feminine novel. And I think sort of it's feminist in the sense that there definitely are these misogynistic elements to it. You know, she's very, I think her mother embodies that quite well, that she imposes a set of regulations on Tita that she's strictly not able to break out from. So yeah, I guess in that sense that there is a misogynistic sense to it, but it doesn't really emanate from Tita, and she's the one that's trying to break out of it. And her sister Gertrudis is a bit of a beacon of that, in that she breaks out from the same misogyny. Yeah, so Tita's certainly a victim of misogyny, but I don't think she enforces it. She doesn't really play into the values of her society and her time.
Good, great. I wonder if we just move on to something else that I think that I read in your personal statement that you'd seen, which was También la lluvia by the director Isiar Boyain, the Spanish director. This is a bit of a big question, and feel free to kind of think about it. But if I had to ask you to, or if I asked you to compare something like También la lluvia and Como agua para chocolate and their kind of visions of Latin America, how would you begin to kind of contrast both of those?
That's interesting. I guess you could look at it through perhaps a theme of exploitation, which is quite common, both of them, and maybe in different senses. And they do sort of both play on stereotypes, but in different ways. So I think with Como Agua, you've got this exploitation of Tita, in that she's not allowed to break out of, she's not allowed her own freedom. She's not really allowed freedom of thought, free will. She has to sort of follow very rigid structures that were maybe common to sort of 19th century Mexico. And there's a lot of sort of people trying to take advantage of her and her skills with cooking, things like that. A lot of that she's sort of exploited in that sense. And then that's sort of seen in a similar way, in the sense that there's exploitation in También la lluvia as well, especially with the natives. You've got this sort of internal colonialism. I guess neo-colonialism might be a way that you could, might be a term.
That's interesting. What do you mean by neo-colonialism?
I guess it would be sort of colonialism in the modern age. So the idea that colonialism never really died, and that it's sort of, it's still alive, but in other ways it's sort of evolved. So people are still being exploited, indigenous people are still being discriminated against and suffering, but not in the sense of a military invasion and occupation. It's sort of more, again, still taking advantage of them. And it's sort of this native people, like Tita, presented as a bit helpless, that sort of, that suffer. And I guess sort of, there's stereotypes as well to both texts, in the, in Como Agua, there's these sort of, Tita has these stereotypes in placed on her. I think she's told by her mother that you don't think anything and that's it, sort of thing. And that's because she's not allowed to think anything. But then these sort of stereotypes are somewhat played into in También la lluvia, but also inverted, in that the sort of indigenous people are sort of, that they are described as sort of politically aware and strong sort of moral sense, which maybe a colonial perspective wouldn't have. It'd be more focused on stereotypes. So I guess you could look at sort of stereotypes and exploitation as a way of sort of,
yeah. So what's, I mean, thinking about the way that the indigenous people are presented in Boyain's film, what's neo-colonial about that? How might you apply kind of neo-colonial lens to the indigenous representation of that film?
I think it's in the sense that you've got this idea of a film within a film. So basically what happens is there's a sort of a European filmmaking company that wants to make a film about the conquest of sort of the Americas around the time of Columbus and sort of the what happened after that. And that's sort of trying to be recreated. It's set in modern day, but they don't really have enough of a budget. They don't really have enough of a cast. So they have to rope in Indigenous people on sort of quite low wages, if any, to sort of play certain parts, and a lot of the sort of more graphic elements are being sort of forced on the colonial things that, on the Indigenous people, things that maybe they don't really want to recreate in a film because it hits home quite personally. So it's neo-colonial.
So that's the sense, I suppose, of the critique being directed towards. Is it towards the film industry? Is that who bears the brunt of the critique in this film? And if so, what about Bojain herself? I mean, does she escape from some of this critique because she's making it? I mean, is it enough to kind of critique the film industry to save yourself from that same critique?
I think she does save herself from critique. I think I'd be careful to be unfair on her. But I think, yeah, I don't think she's entirely sort of innocent either. I mean, she detaches herself not necessarily because she's the director, but you've got this idea of the film within a film, which gives her distance from what's going on. You know, she's a filmmaker that's sort of making a film about people making a film, so she's sort of very well detached from this sort of exploitation that's going on. She's not really linking herself to it. And I think sort of her projects outside where she was making the film showed that she was trying to sort of support these local areas in real life. But yeah, I guess you've kind of got this idea that she's not necessarily exempt from critique. There were, I think, a few controversies around the making of the film. And I think sort of the main targets, I guess, could be the film industry, but I think that's sort of a veil for something a bit bigger. I think it's looking at sort of the globalized world, sort of the world banks and things like that, sort of these big global institutions that still exploit people in this sort of neo-colonial way. Not necessarily through sort of the military occupations of a couple of centuries ago, through another way, through economic gain, and just taking advantage of people that don't necessarily have the same sort of influence and power on the world as they do.
Yeah.
Would you say it's a form of capitalist colonialism then?
It is in a sense. I don't think the film's an overt criticism of capitalism as such, but there is this sort of greed and drive for profit, which, it doesn't represent the entirety of capitalism, of course, but there's this sense of sort of people being pushed aside for the profit and for the sort of what the good of the people that are making the film. Yeah, so I guess it is. I don't think it's an overt criticism, but I think that's certainly present.
Good. Well, I'm afraid that's all we've got time for on the personal statement. I wonder if we could just move on just for about 5 to 8 minutes on the passage that you were preparing. It's quite an interesting passage, right? Quite interesting written. I wonder if you could just begin by, and actually I should take a parenthesis here and say to those of you who are watching, this is the point where we would usually jump into the target language. But given that not all of you are applying to study Spanish, we're going to stick in English, but hopefully this will give you a kind of sense of what we might discuss in the target language in your interviews. So James, I wonder if you could just begin by telling us what the text is about.
So from what I could make out, it was sort of a description of a room or sort of a house more generally. There's no sort of human presence, and sort of nature animates itself and becomes alive, sort of is personified, and a lot goes on in the absence of a human. Sort of doors are being moved by the wind, sort of what might go on in a room when someone's not there. If the wind comes in, a few things get brushed around, but obviously that's sort of dramatized a little bit.
And what do you mean by personification? Can you give me some examples of this?
Yeah, so
I mean, like actual examples from the text.
Yes, so personification generally would be the sort of animation of, well, giving human qualities to a non-human thing. So you've got the description sort of early on in the first I think the fourth line, sort of the wind crept around corners and ventured. So this idea that the wind can't physically venture, but that's what it's being described to be doing. And that sort of goes on quite a lot in the second paragraph. It says sort of the little as mounted, sort of the staircase and bedroom doors. So this idea that it is sort of given a lot of human qualities quite consistently.
There's another one in line 7 where they talk about the air as asking the wallpaper something.
Yeah.
What kind of effect does that have on the reader when we have inanimate objects talking to one another?
I think that's, yeah, that's quite interesting. I think it's something a little bit different. It's not really something that we would consider. You know, personification is quite common in text, but this idea of them asking, sort of almost a vocal element, it is interesting because it's something that, you know, I guess in my sense, it made me sort of consider what can nature do that we're not aware of. You know, the ways in which nature maybe communicates. We communicate with nature, and we communicate with each other. So that means nature must communicate with itself as well. So that's sort of the sense I got from it. But yeah, it was maybe more interesting example of personification.
And what about the actual questions that are asked at the end? I mean, it's not just the fact that the air is speaking to the wallpaper. We have examples of the questions that are being asked. Were they allies? Were they enemies? How long would they endure? What do you make of those questions?
Yeah, I think that the fact that you've got 3 questions put together, sort of consecutively after each other, it's a sense of questioning that sort of ultimately is imparted on us as well. So we're asking questions in the same way that nature's asking questions. We're trying to sort of make sense of the world, but so is nature. I guess it could be that way. The sense of inevitability as well, sort of how long would they endure slightly early on, sort of would it hang much longer, when would it fall? This idea that, you know, there's not always a constant, there's something that, you know, there might be an end to things. I think nature's trying to make sense of the world around it in the same way that we, I guess. But.
Yeah, I mean, the 2 words I find interesting here are allies and enemies. Now, of course, they're questions, so they're not saying that someone is an ally or someone is an enemy, but they're at least suggesting that that's a possibility, right? That these inanimate objects, the air, the wind, the wallpaper, could be enemies, right? I mean, is that scary? Is it not scary?
I think it is. It's not really something I thought about. So I think, yeah, the idea that maybe there's sort of binaries and things in the way that humans can have allies and enemies. I guess it sort of lends into that consideration that maybe nature can as well. Maybe not everything. I got quite a sense of sort of a unified sense of nature towards the end, but I guess something, yeah, as you've pointed out here, there's maybe this sense of division, and maybe not everything's as unified as it's made out to be, and nature's
or maybe there's an attempt to impose a binary onto something which evades binaries, right? There's an attempt to think about nature in human terms of enemies and allies, friends and foes.
Yeah,
I'm not sure the passage tells us what the right answer is, but I think it's at least a question that's worth asking.
Yeah, I think so. And the fact that they're actual questions in themselves invite us to think about that indirectly. 3 questions consecutively at the end of a paragraph sort of it gives us that break to consider it before we move on to the next one. And I think it's quite interesting that you've got this symmetry and this link between a human's perspective of the world, looking for allies and enemies, whether that's something that we should agree with or not, or like associate ourselves with or not. And nature's quite interestingly doing the same thing. So I guess maybe in, you know, that you've got this standard personification of sort of creeping around corners and venturing, but you've also got personification in a physical sense, but maybe even in a moral sense, in that it's personified physically, but it's personified morally, the way that nature's not only taking on human characteristics physically, it's taken on the way that we think about the world as well. So nature is sort of very much human in the way that it's thinking about what's around it, I guess. But.
Yeah, I mean, given what you've just said, how would you then think about the underlined sentence? So lines 25 to 28, it comes at the end of the passage. How does those ideas of nature communicating, nature being divided, unified, how does it fit with this final sentence?
Well, I think the thing that stood out to me in the underlined passage was the repetition of together 4 times. This sense of a collective effort. It's sort of this collectivized element of nature. I guess if you are sort of still looking at a human element, I don't know if this is a bit of a reach, but maybe sort of on a political sense, it's almost sort of communist in the sense that everything's brought together. This sense of a collective effort. I don't know if that's sort of too far, or whether that might be sort of what the author's playing into.
I mean, there's certainly a sense of a collective here, right? I mean, there's certainly imbuing nature with a sense of collective. What does this collective end up doing at the very end of this paragraph?
It's sort of
with the kitchen door.
Yeah, so the kitchen door slams at the end, and
Uh-huh.
you can assume that things return back to how they were. So it's almost cyclical in the way that you've got this piece at the start that's interrupted by nature, and then everything sort of goes quiet again. So that there is a start and an end.
And it's nice to think. It's nice to think of visualizing this scene, because visually not much happens, but when you read this, you realize that there's so much going on behind the scenes, or we could imbue a scene like this with so much information and so much, I don't know, character in a way. Now, you mentioned interestingly at the very beginning that there's personification, but there are no people. What about at the very end there? Who's Mr. Carmichael? Surely he's a person.
Yeah, Mr. Carmichael. Yeah, so this is something at the end. So it's sort of human's almost a footnote at the end, in that, you know, it places a massive emphasis on the presence and the ability of nature, and humans are sort of secondary to that, rather than sort of it all being about humans and nature's sort of the footnote. It's quite.
Well, actually, I'm just gonna stop you there, because actually, Mr. Carmichael does actually appear earlier in the text, at one point. So if I direct you towards lines 20 and 21, so we're talking about the air here, looking upon the shut eyes and the loosely clasping fingers. I mean, these eyes and these fingers actually belong to Mr. Carmichael.
Oh, okay.
What do you think Mr. Carmichael is doing at that point, if his eyes are shut and his hands are clasped?
I mean, I guess he could be asleep, if sort of his eyes are shut. So I guess you could, if that is the case, then it's a sense of he's asleep and nature sort of acts around him. So again, even though a human's sort of present, they're not really aware. It's nature that's doing work.
And when does Mr. Carmichael become aware of what's going on around him? Because in the very final sentence, he's not asleep. Here, Mr. Carmichael, who was reading Virgil, blew out his candle. It was past midnight. So he's not asleep anymore there. What's happened?
So has he been awoken potentially by the slamming door?
Exactly. He's been awoken by the slamming door. It's as if the wind is infiltrating his house, moving around him. You know, he's still sleeping. But then finally, when the wind leaves his house and slams the door, he wakes up.
Right. Okay. So yeah, that makes more sense then, in that nature is still sort of acting on him, and even though he sort of becomes aware, like whether he's aware or not, nature's acting on him, and the fact that nature sort of wakes him up is quite interesting. It speaks to the power of nature. That sort of
it does. It speaks to the power of nature, and it also speaks to the differences between nature and human beings. I mean, if we look at lines 15 to 16, the winds have made their way into upstairs, and then it says, "But here surely they must cease.
Yeah.
Whatever else may perish and disappear, what lies here is steadfast." So what's the parallel that's being raised there between the human and the non-human?
I guess it's sort of this idea that things must come to an end, and that you know, a human's day or a human's life will inevitably come to an end. There's a sense of inevitability, but in the sense nature is eternal, nature sort of ongoing. It's outside of time almost. So this idea that a human would expect it to come to an end, even though there might be these brief pauses, it will come back and it will return. So I feel like, yeah, it's speaking to this sort of eternal sense of nature, when a human isn't eternal. I guess, yeah.
Good, great. So that's all we have time for, I'm afraid. There's lots more we could discuss about this text, but we won't. Do you have any questions for us, James, at this point? You don't have to, it's not part of the interview, but if you do, feel free to ask them.
No, I don't think I do. I think that's...
No? Okay, great. Well, thank you again for coming to see us today. And that's the official end of the interview. So thanks.
Okay.
Thank you, James.
Bye.
Bye-bye.